Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to this week's edition of Imperial as One's Belonging series, where we explore the lived experiences of individuals from the Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities. And each week I say this, each week we have a special guest. And this week is no exception, because this week we have Beau Jensen McCubbin. I'm going to say your surname wrong, McCubbin. I'm hoping I've said that right. Yeah. And Beau is a conservationist, and he's a conservationist, I think, a natural scientist, conservationist who is passionate about the natural world, but so much more. Beau, I'm not going to steal your thunder. I'm going to ask you just to, as I always do, I ask that first question. Can you give me an idea of what it is that gave you your sense of belonging, your sense of identity, as you were growing up?
Sure. Hello, and thank you so much for me, Wayne, and thank you for everyone else watching. What gave me sensitivity as I was growing up? That's a really, really interesting question, because my sense of identity was really blurry growing up. It wasn't clear cut as perhaps I perceive others' sense of identities to be. I come from a mixed European and Asian background, but I grew up in a white family, and that was very much my identity growing up. So much so that I genuinely, as you know, hindsight's a beautiful thing, but as unusual as it sounds, I wasn't aware that I looked different, you know, until I was about 10, 11. There were clues, but certainly other people noticed it and asked questions, and those sorts of questions were always sort of covered over. But I was very much brought up in a white family, and that being my identity. So I did have this big realization that, you know, I don't look that way, and that's fine. But what that does mean for me, and something that I realized very early on, was that meant that my journey is very different, that the world treats me very differently, and they see something that I wasn't aware of first. And so that made for, you know, really sort of interesting negotiation. And then around about the same age, my well, probably earlier, if I'm honest, my sexuality was starting to form more of my identity, and that sort of overshadowed the color of my skin for quite some time. It was it was an interesting one, but I think that what formed my identity, I was quite an insular, quiet child, and the hobbies and my interests that I surrounded myself with, sort of, you know, in a solitary sort of way, sort of formed more of my identity, you know, from the other stratifications did, up until, you know, probably up until I went to university, really.
So it was, so you mentioned about the fact that kind of like as you were growing up, you weren't aware that you were different, even though there was a kind of like underlying inkling that you were different, because there were cues which other people would say, but from your perception, you were just an ordinary little white boy.
I absolutely. I absolutely thought I was white, because that's what I was told in a very, you know, I think behind why I was told that came from what people thought was a good place. You know, it came from a kind, you know, it was what they thought was a kind thing. And I absolutely had no idea. I was born, raised, grew up, and for most of my life lived in West London. I see lots of people, you know, and from school, and, you know, from being out and about, everyone looking different. I was just not aware that I looked different too. It's weird to think about, but it was an honest realization, even though those cues and clues were there, and you know, people would ask, you know, oh, your son, or they would ask me directly, oh, where does he get his looks from? Is he Asian, or is it da 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 da? And those questions would always be sort of squirreled away, and I had no other reason to think otherwise. I don't know. I just look how I look, and but I'm white. So the realization that I wasn't came a lot later on for me.
So during those times, did you have a sense that you were being treated any differently? So have you got brothers and sisters? Were they treated any differently to yourself?
I in hindsight, yes.
Right.
You know, absolutely. There were things that I was put at, of a disadvantage of. In no small measure, my sense of identity. You know, not only who I am and what my past is, but also how the world is going to treat me, how the world is going to see me, and the questions or the things that I'm given as a result of that. But as a kid, no. I just was painting a really colourful picture of just me just walking through my childhood being so unaware. But no, I wasn't aware of any disadvantages or advantages or any negativities other than your usual playground things that I imagine everyone sort of goes through. As a child, no, I wasn't aware of any differences. It wasn't until I was older that I could reflect. But part of that is, again, I thought I was white, and I grew up in a space that was not necessarily as welcoming to other cultures and colors could be. You know, and but I was the default. I was the preferred. You know, so that is how that's what I thought. That's what I believed, and that's how I assumed as being treated. And again, in hindsight, looking back, there were absolute disadvantages. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So you said that your awareness kind of started to kick in when you went off to university, is that right? So can you give us, or was it,
a little sooner, about 10 or 11, it was my awareness of what color I actually was. But my sense of self involving my color was a bit overridden by my sexuality. It was there, but it was overridden by other forms of identity. And it wasn't until I went to university that I actually started to think, do you know what? You know, this is a thing. It affects me every day, and this is something that I need to embrace. And those sort of more conscious thoughts behind the color of my skin started to kick in my late teens.
In your late teens. So there's kind of like the element of your, as you mentioned, your sexuality, and also then your ethnic or ethnicity, as it were. Those two then started to intertwine, or to start to help you, or start to get you thinking about who I am, what's my identity, what identity do I want others to perceive me as?
Absolutely, right? and where I belong,
and where you belong, yeah.
And interestingly, that you know, you use the word intertwine, and it absolutely was that, because not only was I I'll call it a struggle, because it was a struggle. I struggled and what being around and what it means for how I'm perceived, or opportunities, or things that might hold me back, or indeed propel me forward, or whatnot. Those things really did intertwine, because they didn't necessarily go hand in hand. You know, the color of my skin, in spaces where that might be celebrated, my sexuality might not necessarily be celebrated, and in areas where my sexuality might be celebrated, the color of my skin might not be. So those things did intertwine, and they conflicted too.
Yeah, yeah. So when you got so at university, you said this is where kind of like where all of these things, and now you're starting to question yourself and question what did you do? Kind of like what did you do to kind of like reconcile these internal, was it internal conflicts, or what was it? What was happening to you? I suppose is what I'm trying to find out.
Yeah, no, yeah. I did a couple of things, but all the things that I did, I was owning it.
Right.
So in one aspect, I became really proactive. You know, I joined communities and committees. I became the equal opportunities officer for my union,
Hmm.
to really sort of highlight, raise awareness, and try to sort of make change. So and own it in that way. But another thing I did that sort of contradicts that was while still owning it, I also started to rebel in a direction that perhaps wasn't overly helpful. Perhaps it was then, but in hindsight, it wasn't so helpful. And so, for instance, um, sort of being in queer spaces, I didn't appreciate when I was younger. I
Hmm.
sort of rebelled against that and rebelled, I sort of felt it was segregative. I thought it was, making a division, whereas we should be sort of having being more bringing things together.
Yeah.
And whilst that's lovely and important, but it's also, I didn't really appreciate what those safe spaces afforded me, and not until a lot later on. And now I'd actually
Hmm.
absolutely advocate for it. Being in those spaces that are designed to be safe is so important. But yeah, I rebelled against it a little in terms of them. But I think that's the folly of the folly of youth. I can take on the world sort of thing.
You were looking. Well, maybe I'm paraphrasing it, but you were looking at an ideal scenario where you were actually saying, "I should be able to be whoever I want to be,
Mhm.
right? And I shouldn't have barriers to that." Is that kind of the
Absolutely. I
yeah?
was thinking 100 years ahead, and expecting everybody to follow suit. But now, with a lot of my work in equity and inclusion, whatever the stratifications you're sort of focusing on might be, I've really come to appreciate the importance of those safe spaces. So, you can be yourself, which is, that's something that I've always sort of strived for. It's having that highlighted and made, center, highlighted and made paramount. I've really come to appreciate. It's
Yeah, because that makes sense. That makes so much sense in terms of um, actually moving from that idealized world to actually living it, the lived reality of the world that we're in. That people aren't necessarily going to accept you just because you've asked them to accept you. They're not necessarily going to do that. So you then, those safe spaces are safe because they afford you that ability to be yourself.
absolutely, and I found them so important, um, because the color of my skin doesn't never benefited from having that safe space in your family,
Yeah,
where you can be prepared
yeah,
for that means in the world. And hiding my sexuality for so long, again, didn't come from a safe space where I could talk openly about these things, not even in school. I'm old enough to, I had one experience where I asked questions and I was told not to because of certain
right.
laws that existed. So I I was never afforded that initial protection. And when these two sometimes counterintuitive things in terms of the culture I was in became such two big parts of my identity, there was no protection there. I had no previous skills developed to be able to counteract any of the things that might be coming towards me. So I think that element of trying to, right now, that's, I'm fine, I'm normal, and I don't need a safe space. I think it juxtaposes nicely against that, and I think that's probably where that came from, or certainly
Yeah.
that attitude came from.
So in terms of, I'm just trying to think about kind of like, because you're searching for that sense of belonging. Did you have confidants? Did you have people who you could, because you said kind of like within the home from a race perspective, it was kind of like you are white. So just accept that you're white. Did you ever have anywhere where you could actually challenge or have anyone who could reaffirm and say, you're beautiful as you are, with all of your complexity, well, not complexities, but all of everything that is you is beautiful. Yeah.
Not until I was much older, and
right.
even now, I think I don't want to make excuses for other people's behaviours or whatnot, but the caveat behind why perhaps my identity was framed as white wasn't wholly, I'll say wholly, it wasn't wholly or necessarily because of an aversion to a different colour skin. It was more the skin that I received came from a person who impacted my family quite negatively and was cut out of our lives, and I've had contact since, and perhaps it was more of a, you're one of us, you're not that negative person, and a little bit of sort of casual racism or ignorance followed through with that. But I, as I said at the beginning, I think it came from a kind place. But even now, it's a conversation that isn't necessarily welcomed with open arms. It comes from a very dark place in our family's history. It's not, and so any talk of the color of my skin, in my head, I'm talking about me now, whereas in other people's minds, they might be thinking of some sadder places back then. So even now, there's not really culture in my family of let's embrace this and talk about this. It's more of a, that was in the past. But I found my own family. I found my own team, my own group that we can talk about this, and we can discuss positives and negatives and funny things and terrible things. I very much found that space by myself.
So tell me, I'm very curious, because I am curious, but I'm just curious about how this, your quest for finding yourself, how did that translate into the kind of work that it encouraged you to do? Were the two were they separate? Were the two don't meet, or were there areas of overlap? Does that make sense?
It does. It's something that's been apparent right from the word Dosh. So my career very much stems from my interest and hobbies as a young person, and I've been quite fortunate that that I could make that into a career. But the barriers, especially in terms of race, and certainly representation, specifically in my two main areas of work, which is conservation and education, were very apparent from word dot. So, as I say, at university, I became the Equal Opportunities Rep, sort of signifying that was very important to me right from the beginning, and that's something I've carried throughout my work, sort of being that champion of diversity and inclusion on every level, in every area that I've worked in. And it's something that it's not something I discovered, it's something that was massively apparent, and sadly still is. There's still massive underrepresentation proportionately in sciences and in conservation education.
So I remember you telling me a story about, you were telling me a story about when you went to, was it Bali? Oh,
Myanmar, yes, yes,
Myanmar, yeah,
yeah, Burma.
and Burma, sorry, yeah, Burma, and the encounter that you had in Burma and how that kind of like illuminated your thinking. Could you recount that story again for us,
Yeah,
please?
absolutely. It's really interesting. And again, it sort of really reflects perhaps the naivety I had as a young person too.
Mm,
So I went to Myanmar in my early 30s. And so I've been working in my career as in conservation and as a conservation educator for a good how long now? I don't know, 8 years, 10 years, and certainly have been reflecting on equities and equalities for the same length of time.
mm-hmm,
And I run a charity that concentrated on those two things: one, conservation education, and two, equity in conservation education. And the reason I was in Burma is because we were giving free education classes to local communities and to local educators and schools and monasteries and whatnot in learning about local wildlife. And we were doing the same in London and then twinning those schools. So there was a nice conversation going on there with a huge focus on equities around race and socioeconomic stratifications or statuses. And it was brilliant. And really out to Burma, I went with a white woman and a black woman. And after, after days, it was really, really early on in that first trip, we were going, the people that we were seeing a white person or seeing a black person was really.
mm, hello, well, mm,
Hello.
hello. I don't know what happened there.
Hello, Wayne. But you could, Wayne? You're muted.
Okay, I'm back. I don't know. I don't know what happened there. Sorry, people.
No worries. I got to the point where yeah, so I'm in Myanmar, and really early on, one of the huge realization for me was that how people perceived me based on how I looked or based on the color of my skin was registering as the default. You know, I felt invisible. It wasn't necessarily something that was springing to people's minds straight away, especially positioned next to the two other people that I was with, whose race was more diverse from from the people that we were with. And for a minute, it felt amazing. It felt, it really, for the first time, I felt like the default again, like I did when I was a kid, and it was a really, just for a really short time, it was a really, really nice feeling that the way that I look won't reflect or affect negative in these spaces. It's not something that I have to justify. It's not something that I have to code switch for. It's not something that I have to adjust or excuse or highlight. It's not a thing, And sort of reflecting back to when I was in my late teens, where I felt that sort of rebellious. We don't need these safe spaces. We should all just be accepting and
Yeah.
over these things. It felt like that for a minute, and it was that realization that despite me working in the field of inclusion and diversity for a good decade, despite the fact that I'm there because of inclusion and because of being representative and making everyone feel included, I didn't truly appreciate what that felt like until I was there, and it not being a thing. And that was wonderful. And it was a really, really nice realization to have. One that I had never really focused on before, although I focus on it for other people.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's not something that I sort of wanted, or sort of consciously wanted. Well, yeah, absolutely consciously wanted myself. Obviously, subconsciously, there was a huge need for it. And I say that only lasted a short time. It only lasted a really, really short time, because I did then started to feel, well, I don't want to be invisible. I want to stand out. You know, I like that, but I like it to be my choice. And it was just a fascinating realization that that I had, and that was it. It took being in a space where the way I presented myself to the world, on a massive scale, not just a small safe space, not just not just a meeting of an EDI group or a gay club, just everywhere. And I saw representations of myself as an Asian person, and I know that's really, really broad, but because I wasn't brought up in a specific culture, I don't have that link. I don't have that history with in that sort of way. So just being really broadly, just being in an Asian space where everybody looked similar enough to me that the color of my skin or the shape of my eyes just didn't matter with people. It wasn't something that they sort of saw straight away and then made assumptions about it, in terms of other, being othered or different. One realization to have, but it was short lasting. I always sort of compare it to my wedding day. I was really looking forward to, but the amount of attention and focus that I got, I didn't like it. It wasn't something that I enjoyed. Now, I love a party and I love going to other people's weddings, and I love drawing attention to myself. I'm aware of that. I'm very, very self-aware in that regard. But when it came to my wedding day and I didn't have to work for the attention, it was just given, I didn't like it. It was, no, I'm not doing anything interesting. I'm not saying anything funny. I didn't like it. And that's where I got to after that short realization when I was in Burma that first time of, I'm invisible. This is lovely. These things that hold me back, or people make assumptions for how I look back in London, don't exist here. And then, yeah, like I say, in a really short time afterwards, I thought, oh no, I missed that. I missed the positive aspects of it.
Yeah, so it's just really interesting, because it sounds like, you know what, I want to be able to express myself on my terms. I want to be able to be seen on my terms, as opposed to people kind of like not pigeonholing me or making assumptions or any of those things because of what they perceive. I want them to kind of like it's on my terms. I want to interact with you in this particular way or in that particular way.
Absolutely. And it's again, it's half of my work in terms of inclusion and whatnot. But when I want to talk about biodiversity. I don't want to talk about in certain spaces. I'm not here to talk about my sexuality. I'm not here to talk about my race or my identity or whatnot. I'm here to talk about birds.
Yeah.
And but it's so important that I have to talk about these other things, and to make these things apparent and to ensure others are included. But even just that, as important as it is, and as dedicated and passionate that I am about it, in terms of representation and whatnot, in my head, it's boring. Because I've already made that jump. I've already made that realization that perhaps there are barriers in people's way. Perhaps these intricacies or these bigotries are affecting other people negatively, and they shouldn't. And it just seems so obvious. And I've had this conversation with a lot of people, particularly people of color. I think it's very difficult to really appreciate how it affects you and what that feels like if you don't have that lived experience. And the idea that someone's racist and that might affect how they navigate the world or how they interact with others is so daft to me. It's so daft, and it's tiresome that after we're in 2023 and we still have to have these conversations, and I will still have these conversations and I will champion these conversations, but that little bit in the back of my head still thinks, oh, do we still have to fix this? Is this
I totally understand that. And I suppose what we could say is it's very taxing. It's very it consumes it consumes a lot of energy.
It does. It's not and my professional work aside, that's my job and that's my role, and that's what I'm absolutely passionate about. But just as Beau, it's exhausting that these things affect me in a way that people who might be or might present as the default, they don't even have to comprehend. The color of my skin affects everything, to varying levels of other people with dark skin, but it affects the times that I might go to places. It affects where I might holiday. It affects every conversation that I have, knowing that a majority of people will see certain things straight away, rightly or wrongly, but people do, as I do, but it. Recently we've had sort of very open conversations about a question that I get asked all the time. So where are you from? And then you explain where you're from, and oh no, where are you from?
Yeah.
And I think some people who haven't had that question every time they meet someone new for their whole life, it might seem to them, it's just a question. It's not intrusive, it's not rude, it's inquisitive. People are genuinely interested. Like, sure, but it's boring, and it's and it's something that I have to contend with as every person of color, in where I'm aware, so London, Britain, or whatnot. It's these intricacies, minor, we can call them aggressions, these small things that wear away at you over time, and the fact that you have to keep on repeating yourself, it really wears you down.
I'm going to just change the tack just slightly, but it's on the same kind of theme, but looking at it from the fact that you're an educationalist, you're an educator, right? So kind of like when you're working and you're teaching and you're doing your conservation work, your platform is to educate people about the biodiversity and the importance of biodiversity. If we're looking at it from that perspective, what do we also then need to be doing in terms of the education of gender, sexuality, of race? Where do the two kind of like meet, and what can we do?
For me, it's completely holistic. They're one and the same. When we're talking about biodiversity or conservation or nature or natural sciences, humans are a part of that. It affects every single one of us. So whether you're talking about biology or whether you're talking about behavioral change for the climate crisis, we're not the center of it, but we are absolutely a part of it. And that's very much the approach that education should be taking. And I sort of emphasize the word should, because all too often things like people's different stratifications, or sort of give it a cover, or anything vaguely political, sometimes doesn't necessarily sit comfortably with science. These are facts. These are But that's not, it's just not true. These things are absolutely intertwined with each other. And by ignoring them, by literally othering this whole conversation, you're just perpetuating the problems that we've all experienced in the past. You're still perpetuating these institutional barriers that absolutely go against our ethos of trying to reach everybody, of trying to encourage everybody. And the amount of conversations I've had with organizations who make all the right noises, saying the right words, and they're keeping up with the zeitgeist, and the noises that you hear are lovely, but the actions don't necessarily follow behind.
Yeah.
So I'll have conversations about, your this group of people you're working with isn't reflected of the sort of hyper local demographics that are surrounding you, so part of your remit. And the answers back quite often circle around, oh, well, we offer it to everybody. Everybody's welcome. Everybody has access, and these sort of broad, welcoming, inclusive statements don't mean anything. It's not inclusive, it's not equitable. If these were truly equitable, if it was truly open to everybody, and I know you opened your doors, and that's wonderful, and I know you won't judge anyone that walks in based on certain stratifications, brilliant, but they're not coming in, so there is a barrier. And that's a barrier that we have to address. And I think in terms of conservation and conservation education, those barriers won't be broken down until we stop having these conversations, stop making all the right noises and acting on it. And it's not going to happen overnight. It will take a long time to sort of address these things and make things right. But it has to come from a place that's not doing it because it's the thing to do, not doing it because it's the right thing, doing it equitable. Not that they're invalid, but it has to come from a place because you want to, because you're passionate about it.
Yeah.
And that goes hand in hand with the second point of what needs to change. And these changes are happening. Some places quicker than others, but these changes are happening. But it has to come from a place from true representation, from lived experience. It can't be patronizing. It's very much those, our doors are open to everybody. Yeah, but with saying come in isn't welcoming. We built these places and the people haven't come yet. So what do we need to address? And it has to come from a place of representation and authentic passion behind the need, not because I think it's the right thing to do.
Fantastic. There's two questions. I don't know if anyone else has questions from the audience. If anyone does have, then just put your hand up and we can come to it very quickly. But there was two things which, based on what you were just saying, when you started the answer, you said about it's from a conservation point of view that we're all in this together, yeah? And that humans aren't necessarily at the center. Okay, from that, it got me thinking, actually, when we think about ourselves being at the center, that's where the problem often begins. Yeah, it's that we have to take ourselves away from the center and to look at it, as you said, in a more holistic way, in order for us to then see that we are only a small part of a very big microcosm of activity. So accept our place and do better.
Right? Absolutely. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. So from that, when we speak about our interactions with other humans, and based on all of these other factors, if we were to step back and not always consider ourselves to be at the center, to look at it from somebody else's point of view, I think we'd be in a much more advanced place than where we currently are.
you hit the nail on the head. You know, the comparisons between conservation and equity and equality, you know, within humans are absolute. They go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and by focusing on humans as a species as the center, as the default, as the reason for everything, and everything has to benefit this one species, is the problem in terms of the climate crisis or extinction crises. That's absolutely the problem. It's not until we realize we are not the center, we are part of a whole, that actually, and we're very different, and celebrate those differences, and you know, yeah. But it's not until we sort of stop looking at problems from how does this affect me? How does this benefit me? So stop looking at in that sort of selfish tranche, that we can then really address the issues and see how there is a balance completely holistically. And that goes hand in hand with, for instance, equity in conservation education. It's not until we stop looking at that default, start looking at that institution, or the way that things have been done in the past, or the people that we look up to, or how things have done and who they've been done by, or who's been hidden, you know, for that argument. It's not until we stop thinking about that and then how we bring people in, it's looking at it holistically and how we all fit in it together. As I say, you know, everyone with a conservation message, everyone with an education provision, I hope, wants to include everyone. And you know, and the sheer basis of equity is, you know what, it's currently not involving everyone, so we're going to have to actively do something to involve everyone. And perhaps looking at it from that different perspective, perhaps looking from it away from that sort of institutionalized historical default. It won't be until we step away from that that we can fully embrace these two very important topics and move forward with them.
Fantastic. Beau, I'm going to ask the final questions. Now, as I said, there's a kind of like 2 or 3 questions in one, as it were. My first question is what advice would you have given to your younger self? The second part of the question is, what would your younger self look at you now and say, wow? Wow. So those are the 2 questions which I'm going to ask.
The advice I'd give my younger self would be, there was this lovely campaign which gained a lot of traction a few years back by an LGBT plus conservationist activist in America called Dan Savage, and the campaign was "It Gets Better." And that really hit a note with me, as it probably did with a lot of people that have been othered or affected by, you know, certain bigotries and whatnot. And the advice I'd give my younger self was, it gets better. However dark things get, however difficult things get, however hopeless things might seem at times, you're going to find a place. You're going to find people. You know, you're going to find individuals that think your way, that you know, that are going to believe in you, that are going to accept you for who you are, that are going to make you feel valid. And you know, I think that's sort of the point of it. You know, having that validity, and it will get better. It's going to be long, it's going to be difficult, and it's not going to be perfect, but it will get better. That's probably the best advice I could give him. And worry a little bit less. Things that are out of your control, worry just a little bit less about it. The thing that I think would make my younger self say, wow, about me now, he'd be really, really impressed that the things that I was passionate about as a young person, I'm still passionate about now. So whether that's nature, whether it's my stamp, he'll be really impressed with my stamp. Whether it's the hobby, collecting things and hiking and exploring and whatnot, he'll be really impressed that not only were there not only were they a really good source of joy, but also now I'm older and I don't have to ask permission and I have my own money to spend on things that, you know, the sort of promises you make. Well, one of the I was never allowed a dog as a kid, and one of the promises I made myself was, when you're older, you get a dog, and I have 4 now. So that's generally how I feel. But in a more serious note, I think one thing I hope that my younger self would sort of be impressed and say, "Wow," at that for so long I didn't have a voice. I didn't have a place where I belonged. Thankfully and gratefully, with a lot of beautiful people, I found that validity. And I think one thing that my younger self would say wow to is that champion for others and giving a voice to others and creating spaces for others that felt isolated, as I did, as he did.
Fantastic. Beau, it's been absolutely brilliant having this conversation with you. As I say every week, and I mean, I really could just sit here and talk to you for another couple of hours as we did earlier on in the week. But really a big thank you for sharing your story, your experiences, and for the insight and wisdom that you've given us about, you know, coming together, not being effectively, let's not be so selfish. Let's look at the bigger picture, a more holistic picture, because that's when we'll achieve so much more together, when we're not just looking out just for number one, but for everyone. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I just want to add, thank you to Wayne. Thank you for listening. This has been so cathartic for me. This conversation and our last conversation is so cathartic. But thank you for this, for the program. Thank you for giving, you know, platforms to voices that need to be heard. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to just let everyone know what we're going to be seeing next week. Just a minute. Just a second. A few technical issues this week, but normal service should resume next week, I hope. Let's see. So next week we're going to have 1 second. Technical issues. We're going to have Tammy Akinde, and she is the founder of Black Women in Science Network, and she's a PhD student at Cambridge University. And then, if you haven't seen some of the other episodes of Belonging, then please go to our YouTube channel, and you should be able to you should be able to see the other episodes that we have done on that. Sorry, this is a bit of a disaster today in terms of my sharing, but we will, as I said, normal service will resume next week. As I said, let's go back. It's Tommy King Buddy. She's the founder of Black Women in Science Network and a PhD student at Cambridge University. And as I said, go to our YouTube channel, which is tinyurl.com/belonging-IAO. And as I say each week, none of these would have happened if it wasn't for the many, many, many people who have volunteered their stories and shared their stories with us. Remember, guys, this week it's Mothering Sunday. So please make sure that you get your mother a gift. If anyone had forgotten, right, it's Mothering Sunday, and they are so much of our stories. So make sure that you remember. So until next week, I want to say another big thank you, and I will see you again very soon. Take care. Let me just